We're getting towards the end of this week's Phil and Simon show. Phil and I wanted to have a little chat about the documentary on Netflix called Crip, which features Judy Heumann and another chap called Jim Lebrec, and just some amazing disabled people. What what did you get from it, Phil? What did you think?
Um, well, you've used the word amazing, so I can't use that again. I found it very moving. It reminded me, because I'm that little bit older than you, so it kind of spoke to some of the things that I remember. Although I have to say, I didn't come across disability rights until 10, 15 years after that film was made. So, and I don't remember anything of its equivalents in the UK. I don't, I certainly didn't go to a Gen Ed. The name of the camp in the movie is Camp Gen Ed. I didn't go there, or that kind of thing. It was very powerful, and what, of course, we've just had the most fantastic conversation with Judy Heumann, and she emerges in the film as a spokesperson for the gang, so to speak, and of course went on to do some amazing things in terms of the civil rights movement, particularly in the US. But she's also been an incredibly important figure in the UK too, because I think what has to be remembered is that what was going on at Camp Gen Ed then, and as the movement progressed in America, the UK was busily watching this and beginning to think about its own struggles and so on. So, and a really, really good. I mean, I would urge anybody to watch it, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's a standalone, good documentary produced by the Obamas and very well made. And I was about halfway through, and they just started to do some really strong campaigning, including blocking the streets in New York and basically shouting down a politician who was trying to argue with them, and they just blasted him until he got nowhere. And I had to text a friend. I kind of got excited. I was like, and there was two things. There's this whole thing about taking direct action that we don't seem to do very often now. But there was this second bit that I really am a big fan of, and I constantly want youngsters to have, which is pride. There was a pride in who they were. There was we're not ashamed. We're not going to apologize. This is the deal, and you need to change. We're not the problem. They talk about going to get ice cream, and the public stared at them and felt very uncomfortable with them. And I get that, and I know that. But you're like, damn you, we're not going to hide away. You need to change how you think.
Yeah, there was all of that. And there was some very practical bits of the movie that made me think. For example, when they occupied the government buildings, these are some of the most severely disabled people. I mean, really profoundly disabled people who are now sleeping on the floor for 21 or 20 however many nights. And they're not eating food. Several of them go on hunger strike and stuff. And I just think physically how that must have been so difficult to do.
Well, and add on, FBI turned off all the telephones. So what do? They started using sign language out of the windows to get their messages out. So cool. Then they ran out of food, but the Black Panthers, who were a very strong political group then, started bringing in food. And they said, why are you doing this for us? Why are you doing it? And the Panthers saying, you are trying to make a better world for everybody. We support people who do that.
Yeah.
Oh.
That was one of the most important things. And I think when we were talking to Judy earlier, she made the point very powerfully that this isn't just about disabled people. It's about women. It's about people of color. It's all of that stuff, gay rights. And I guess one of the things that she was suggesting, and I think the film talks about, is how you make alliances with other organizations and learn from them and adapt your strategies to do things that work. It's an excellent film. I mean, really good movie.
To do that, you need the strong leadership who can sort of cross boundaries, and that's what the Judys and the Janes and the others we know. Do you remember in the documentary they go to well, I don't even want to call it a care home. It's a place called Willowbrook, and it's an institution with people with, again, profound learning disabilities. I can feel myself getting upset now. I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble. It reminded me of a concentration camp for Jewish people.
Exactly.
Looking at the bodies, they're lying around in their own feces, they're not being fed.
Yeah. And
This
this
was
was the 1970s, remember?
in the
Not
United
that long
States.
ago, yeah, in the United States. And we saw pictures like that coming out of Europe when the Balkans War was going on, and they uncovered these Romanian orphanages with,
Yeah,
you remember those images?
yeah.
I certainly remember them. I don't know if our listeners will, but that was horrific. And it was a really powerful reminder of what the struggle is actually about.
Yeah.
If it's really about, confining disabled people to these institutions and letting them rot there, then we're in a really bad place.
Well, it's the other end of the scale of we go for ice cream and upset people, and that what they want is to be shut away. And you're like, damn it, no way. The media, so the media locally were following it around San Francisco, in Berkeley, and there's a lovely line. One of the media people say, and the building is an occupation by an army of cripples. And it really made me laugh. Now, there always needs to be, I think, a bit of luck. It's a bit like if you're a football team and you win, you need a bit of luck. If you something to happen, and in the documentary they talk about the technicians who went on strike, so they were lacking news stories, and suddenly their protest went nationwide, and suddenly the politicians start
Yeah,
tumbling down.
because what was significant was, of course, they formed a good relationship with this particular reporter who wasn't disabled. They had got no traction whatsoever with the governor or with President Carter, who was then president. And when that story hit all the main news feeds, it was very obvious that very quickly the governor and the president began to take much more interest. I think, too, what was lovely was that reporter was kind of now embedded with the group. We keep hearing, don't we, about I'm embedded with the troops in Afghanistan or whatever. He was embedded with the disability group. But it was important because he was telling the story, as was the guy making the movie telling the story, but this was a news feed.
It was a very smart thing to do. I think as disabled people, we're very cautious of media and news media and how they represent us.
Yeah.
And that was a gamble even then, but they somehow got it right. There's a line in, they talk about it, if not now, when? As in, we can't give up. There was another line. I didn't get my head around it. There's a phrase they use, separate but equal, and they rejected it.
Yes.
What did you get from that as a phrase?
Well, it linked to this idea that they had education for disabled kids and they had education for non-disabled kids, but the education was equal, except because it isn't. So it was something linked to that. It was this idea that they were treating us fairly because they were treating us separately, but actually that's not what we want. It's a bit like the Rosa Parks thing about being on the bus. She's on the bus, but she's only told where she can sit. That's not equal. That's not being treated fairly, is it?
An American who I saw last year said to me, Rosa Parks would have still got to the destination, but that wasn't the point. So that's exactly it.
That's exactly right. Yes.
I mean, there's that lovely bit there. Half of them are hippies. There's clearly a bit of free love. There's a little bit of rock and roll going on.
I think.
and the idea that they'd go around every night and try and convince people to stay and occupy this building, and knowing that people, like you said, half of us wouldn't be able to say that because we'd have died these days. But then they just went for it. It's remarkable.
To knowingly put yourself in that situation, knowing that it, and the hunger strike bit, for example, knowing that this may well kill you, is an appropriate use of the word courage. Because I mean, they were under enormous pressure from all sides. You mentioned the FBI, for example, but they were under pressure from all sides. And they were under pressure from their conditions. The fact that they were getting more and more ill, I'm guessing, as a result of the actions they took. But they had a higher cause, didn't they? It was more about the collective, not themselves as individuals.
Well, and also, if you whittle it down to their single issue at that point, it was a 504. Americans obviously used the name of these, and it was a piece of legislation that said, if you have government money, you must be accessible. Yeah. And they got it in, but no one was taking any notice of it and trying to withdraw it. So if you're a young disabled person now, what that was schools, hospitals, government buildings, local authority buildings, buses, all this, none of them had to be accessible. And they weren't being accessible. This was real basic stuff on public money.
And even if it had been enforced, it only affected federal buildings. It didn't affect all the other buildings. And do you know what this reminds me of?
Tell me, Phil, I'm getting angry.
Oh, it reminds me, Mr. Maggie, of the public sector duty was
Right.
in part of our own act, and our own legislation came in later, if you recall, that was never really enforced. It
Yeah.
was paid lip service to. And I think what the Crip camp and the 504 stuff was about was saying it's not enough to have legislation. You've got to enforce it and you've got to implement it and so on and so forth.
And with that brought to today, we have government briefings every day without a sign language interpreter.
Oh, how is that possible? I've been tweeting about that.
I know.
The fact is that the Scottish and the Welsh Assembly are using sign language interpreter. I haven't seen stuff out of Northern Ireland, but the United Kingdom, how is it not possible for us to provide sign language support for those briefings? It's absolutely bloody terrible, pardon my French.
I think we need to do a demo, Mr. Friend.
I'm out there. Oh, yes.
Are you allowed out,
when do you
though?
want to go?
Well, we've got to wait till lockdown's over, though, because we're not allowed out, because
And
you
I
might
can't
die.
drive. So.
Yeah. So just keep tweeting. We've sorted that one out, haven't we?
Oh, God, we've
Bloody
sold out
nuisance.
already.
Just to say, I did talk about this on BBC Outs, the other show, and with Charlie Swinburne, because there is legal pressure being put on the government on this one. So
It should be necessary, should it? It should be. It's so important that everybody knows what the messages are.
I kind of want to go back 30, 40 years. Oh, one last bit. There's a chap called Ed Roberts who, if he was alive today, would be sitting next to Judy. And I know him through Berkeley, and there's a building called the Ed Roberts campus, which is the most accessible building in the world. He was doing amazing stuff around this time. You mentioned it. Quite a few people who you see at the camp at late teens, early 20s, and then they die.
Yeah. I was particularly struck by that. I at the very end of the documentary, they show that put the names to the main protagonists in the film and their death date, and they were very young. Many of them were very, very young. Their impairments were so severe in some cases. I'm guessing. I don't know what caused their deaths, but it was very sad to think that a very big part of that whole movement died before they saw the ADA come in. In fact, I noticed that several of them died before the actual act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was passed. There's something, and that always makes me think when people tell us to wait, people are dying who haven't got time. Do you know what I mean? We should be doing stuff far more urgently around disability. You've got
You're making me.
You don't want to wait, do you?
You're making me get emotional, and maybe this show, rather than dedicated to those people who are alive, who are doing amazing work, which we love to bits, it should be dedicated to those who have done all that work and aren't alive anymore. And we have those people in the UK as well as the US, around the world. And without them, these conversations wouldn't happen.
We wouldn't be doing this.
Yeah.
No question about that.
Oh, non-contact hug.
Yes.
Oh. Well, let's stop. Yeah, watch Crip Camp. Get Netflix. Send them your password, Phil.
And